Good evening. We're going to spend a large part of Panorama tonight looking at television, at BBC television, because 10 years ago this week, the BBC television service opened up after its long shutdown during the war. Now, do you remember, I wonder, the first ever television service transmitter up at Alexandra Palace, which started its service in 1936 and continued until 1939, and then after the war came into service again. It was just 6 months after the war when BBC engineers, by a piece of real hard labor, reopened the service, June 1946. And in those days, there were only 2 studios. And we now, with our outside broadcast cameras actually at Alexandra Palace, go to one of those 2 studios, Studio A. It looks a bit different as we see it through the Alexandra Palace camera tonight. This is a studio that those who've been in television a long time have many happy memories of. The notices on the walls, the producer's window up in the corner there. A small studio which has seen a great deal of television history and now is filled with the apparatus for experiments in color television. This is the Color Television Center. There's something I bet you've never seen before, a color television monitor. And here, the past and the future together. The little original Emitron camera on the left that we used to use all those years ago, and on the right, one of the new monster color cameras. And then if we go down the corridor, as it were, to Studio B, which is even smaller, this is now the new studio. It was here in 1936 that Baird television was operated. Now they're getting ready for the 10:30 news. Kenneth Kendall there is going to be the announcer, getting some last-minute information, and the news staff ready for the 10:30 bulletin. And that old Emitron camera back in Studio A, by the way, looks a little bit primitive these days, doesn't it? And even more so when you take the top off and see the works. One rather shaky-looking tube strapped to a box underneath, but it gave John and nearly 20 years of very good service, and some very popular programs were transmitted with those cameras from this studio. I can remember one called London Town that I remember with great happiness. Now, the big camera next to this, the color camera, is really 3 cameras in one. This is the biggest and most complex thing you ever saw in your life. You are really looking at the future now in this machine. I think in a way it's very fitting that the studio used for early experiments in television and early program service should now be the studio where they're planning the future. It is indeed very, very different these days, not only because nowadays there are millions of viewers instead of only scores or hundreds of thousands, but because of the apparatus. Those of us who work on this side of the camera, for example, see new gadgets around us. And when the service began to develop, one of the things we noticed most was this. I'd like to show it to you over here. The development of what was called a turret on a camera. That meant that the original cameras, of course, if they wanted to come closer to you or further from you, had to actually move in and out. Now then they've started fitting these things. This is one of the early turret cameras, and if you're a photographer, you'll know what happens. You spin the turret round, change a lens without moving the camera, and bring the subject you're looking at nearer or further away. We might perhaps demonstrate at camera 2. You're looking at me now through camera 2. If I get you to do it for me, would you now spin your turret and go to a close-up? Horrible sight, but there you are. That's a close-up without my moving at all, or you. Now spin to a long shot. And there you have a long shot, and you can see much more now than you could before in the close-up. You haven't moved, I haven't moved, but it's happened. That's a turret. That's an old camera. We've got something very, very new about to come into service. The cameras that you're using tonight on this program and you are looking through at home are themselves about to go out of service, and this is coming in. Would you bring it there? Now, this is the very latest thing. This is the cat's whisker, but rather far removed from cat's whiskers, turrets and all, which is about to come into service in the studio. I wouldn't be surprised, though, you know, if turrets themselves don't disappear one day, because we now use, largely on outside broadcasting, though I did notice it being used in the Jack Benny show last night, if you remember, what is called a zoom. With this, you can fly over people's heads without the camera moving at all, and what is far away suddenly becomes right up close to you with the aid of this apparatus here. I'd like to show you an example of how a zoom is used. which we took from a tele-recording of the Trooping the Colour at the Queen's birthday last week. A moment when we went suddenly from one side of Horse Guards Parade, there it is, as though we were flying over the heads of everybody, close up now to the Guards Memorial on the other side and close up to the Guardsmen. And nobody had moved at all, and yet suddenly you were very near something that you were far away from before. Now this zoom is much used by outside broadcasting. We might perhaps have a look at some of the developments in outside broadcasting now. Oh, one thing before we do. Here is a man by name Alfred Wormser, who has been making for years for television these animated captions, of which we use a great many, and which are now so much used that they're no longer called captions, we call them Wormseries. Now we'll now look, Alfred, at one of your Wormseries, which will show us developments in OBs. Rather an interesting figure. 1946, 1 transmitter and 2 OB units, outside broadcasting mobile units, that is. And then 1956, 14 transmitters all over the country, 4 outside broadcasting units in London, 5 in the regions, not to mention the roving eye, which of course can go almost anywhere. In fact, mobility is one of the great features of OBs these days, and mobility which isn't even dependent on lines or cables, as OBs used to be in the old days. They now can send programs by microwave from mountaintop to mountaintop. This we call in the trade a dish. Very good word for it. It receives a picture, it shoots it over the mountains, and is picked up somewhere else and relayed. So you can now do programs from almost anywhere. I'm being associated myself in a week or two with a program coming from a submarine under the water for the first time, and another one coming direct from the island of Sark in the Channel Islands. That's typical of what one can do nowadays. Well, now, when programs come from lots of different places and chop about, I suppose the classic example was the general election 2 or 3 years ago when we chopped about all over the place all night, they're not handled normally, as it were, by the control room here at Lime Grove, but they pass through a special place called the Switching Centre, which is a broadcasting house. The BBC's lines engineers handle that. And that's going to be the first outside point to which we go now on our television 10-year anniversary tour, if you call it that, to go to the Switching Centre to meet Derek Preston. And Derek, perhaps you'll be kind enough to tell us something of what's going on there, and I'll join you in a moment or two.
We fairly claim to be the hub of the network of television cables and radio. We're connected by cable with a great number of places, including the transmitters and various points in the regions where OBs are brought in. If we look over here, there are a number of cables finishing up on the framework. Now, these cables go down through a hole in the floor. They go underground to the Post Office Television Control Centre at Museum Exchange and fan out from there. Now, this big cable, for instance, goes off to the transmitter at Sutton Coldfield. There's one here which goes to Wenvo, underground, don't forget, 160 miles altogether. And up here is the granddaddy of them all. It's the cable that was put in for outside broadcast purposes 20 years ago and was used for the coronation procession of King George VI in 1937.
Derek, can you hear me?
I can just...
It's a funny thing, but you're making very odd noises to me when I sit in the studio, and I hope you can hear what I'm saying to you now. I was going to ask you to go on telling me, what is this apparatus around you on each side of you?
I can hear you all right now, Richard. Over here are a lot of amplifiers and equalizers, which we use for making the pictures from outside broadcast points to the highest possible quality. I can show you more or less what we do.
Derek, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but there is something horribly wrong with the sound. It would be over a tiny distance like this. We shall have, I'm afraid, to ask you to switch us almost straight away to the roving eye that we want to meet, because we honestly can't understand at the moment what you're saying.
Yes.
Leaving behind all your fine pictures, everything we were hoping to see, and going out of the studio now, I want to meet Douglas Fleming, who is going to turn the roving eye on itself, and we'll ask you, if you will, please, to switch to the roving eye now, will you?
Yes, we're clear.
Well, you join us in Engine Court here at St. James's Palace. There is the roving eye with its aerial on top, No cameraman, I'm afraid, sitting on his gun turret there, because Harry Cowgill's dismounted to shoot the picture you're looking at now. And now lashed up alongside the roving eyes vehicle on its right is the post office OB unit, for this is a line job. We've got no microwave transmitter here tonight, and the picture and sound are carried away by line. But before we come to that, let's just show you something that Richard Dimbleby mentioned earlier, the use of a lens turret, and in order to see what Mr. Mumford here looks like properly, he's going to swing a lens, and you should see him a little nearer. There it is. Well, now, Mr. Mumford is the deputy engineer in charge of the post office, and can probably tell us, in fact, I'm certain he can tell us, what happens to the sound and picture line when it leaves here.
Well, we go from this particular van to the nearest local telephone cable. The signals are passed along the telephone cable to the local exchange, where we amplify them, put them on a cable, they go to another exchange, and so on, until they reach our television switching centre at Museum Exchange.
I see. Not quite like an ordinary telephone exchange.
Not quite like an ordinary telephone exchange. You know, it has to have one or two more refinements.
Well, now, we've heard a lot tonight about the expansion and development of the output side of
Preston
television,
talking and not
especially
me?
perhaps in outside broadcasts. Have you in the post office had any difficulty keeping up with that?
Well, it's no good me pretending that we haven't had our difficulties, but I mean, whatever the difficulty is, we always overcome it, and we always hope we should be able to meet your own demands.
Any time at all?
Any time at all, I hope.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mumford. Well, now, the next time you're with us, you'll be seeing rather a different picture, and until then, goodbye.
Well, now, sorry, I've been trying to sort things out while Douglas Fleming was talking, and I regret very much we've had that bit of trouble with the switching centre. We'd hardly thought we would over a mile. Still, there you are. Now, things have been very different, not only in the world outside, but also in the studios. Now, we come to another of our wormseries, which will give you an idea of how things have changed there, too. You see, 1946, two rather old studios, the ones we saw. 56, 8 BBC television studios in London alone, 5 regional studios, covering the country pretty well, and the television theatre, and covering altogether something like 95% of the population. And that doesn't count the newest and biggest and probably best of them all, which is a new studio which has its first rehearsal tomorrow, and next Monday we'll carry Panorama, all of us, and for several Mondays thereafter. Studio which we're calling Riverside 2. It lies down on the banks of the River Thames near Hammersmith Bridge. And that is where we are able to go now, and indeed are going now, into the gallery of Riverside 2, and there it is, to join the chief lighting supervisor, and from him I hope to hear something about a new and rather wonderful machine which has been put in. You'll see the gallery is quite new. It's fairly standard. The staff are on duty, and here is the lighting engineer. That's Raymond McCulloch, and he has a lighting console, which, Raymond, if you're there...
Yes, good evening, Richard.
I'd like you to explain to us, will you?
Well, this is what we think is the most up-to-date television lighting installation in the world. From this console, I can switch and dim every lamp in the studio, which there are 144, and that means that by fingertip control, it is possible to, for the first time, to adjust the lighting during the actual run of a transmission, so that we hope that it will produce very much better technical quality in pictures. Now, if you'll look through the window, Richard, I will give you a little demonstration.
Thank you very much. Well, now we will turn our camera in the gallery round so it looks down on the floor of the studio, and then as soon as it is round, and I can see it going from here, yes, it's round now, I think we can go back again.
Yes, now you're looking into an absolutely dark studio, and I'm going to bring up on my console a little patch of light, followed by another patch of light, and so on, all the way along the floor, until we come to a camera.
Ah, you caught something in the bag, eh? Well, since we've got a camera there, Raymond, now let me, if you will, give the instruction from here to cut from the camera up with you, down to that camera on the floor, that's it, looking back up at your gallery. I'd like you to come out, if you will,
Yes.
to that control position you have outside, where you can do something else altogether with the lights, can't you?
Yes, well, now I'm outside at the console which controls the actual movement of the lamps. The whole ceiling of the studio is covered with electrically operated hoists, and these hoists you see moving now, and instead of the old-fashioned method of hauling the lamps up with pieces of rope and block and tackle, we now have this new arrangement in which the lamps can be almost instantaneously adjusted to suit every type of scene and every type of production.
Well, I must say you have the most wonderful apparatus you're mounting in Riverside, and personally, from a panorama point of view, I'm looking forward to using it.
Yes, Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Raymond. You've got a rehearsal tomorrow, so we'll leave you to get the things sorted out. And back here in the studio, so you got back before I did, I'm doing very well tonight. Back here in the studio, I have now the job of looking into the future. Well, I don't know what the future holds. The last 10 years have held so much that Lord knows what's coming in the next 10. But there is something on which the future of the television service, I think, is going to depend, and that is this project, which is the development of the new television centre out at White City, where the old exhibition stood some 50 years ago. They're building, sorry about my voice, it's been giving up all day. They're building a new television centre, of which this is already in existence and is being used. It's only 1/8, though, of the site as it will be when it's finished. And the work started in 1951 in July, and when it's all over and the new buildings are there are going to be 7 studios. 4 of them are actually going to be there by 1960. Now, we can look tonight in the studio at a model of this same centre as it will be when it's completed. And as we have with us, and I'm very glad to have with us in the studio, the Director of Engineering of the BBC, Sir Harold Bishop, who is therefore the chief engineer of all the engineers in the corporation. You, Sir Harold, I think can tell us a little about it and its function.
Well, this site at Shepherd's Bush is 13 acres in extent, and we've already built the scenery block at the back there, and another small building here, and we're going, as you said just now, to build part of this middle block, which will contain 4 studios. We've already started on the foundations, and then later on we shall build another part in the front here with 3 more studios, and finally we shall build this spur along here, which will contain other accommodation. So we've got a big project ahead of us.
You have indeed. Could I ask you, since this is part of the future in general, what about the future? What are you expecting to turn up?
Well, our first job, of course, is to complete the coverage of our first program, this program we're doing now. And the BBC wants to do a second program to permit a balanced alternative program. But so far we have not yet been able to get the frequencies, and the government have decided that for the next 2 years at any rate, they will defer their decision about this question of frequencies. So nothing will be done for that period.
Mm-hmm. And now a very important question. Colour, please. What can we expect there?
We haven't really decided yet how colour should be transmitted. An international committee investigated this matter recently and visited the United States, Holland, Paris, and this country to examine what we were all doing. The idea, of course, is that there's a possibility of a European standard of colour so that we all do the same thing. Well, now, the Americans are transmitting colour at the present time, and we are seeing whether we can adapt their system to our standards. We've already done a good many tests. We've been testing now for 6 months or so, and the results are really quite interesting. And the results, it's not a matter for the BBC to decide. The results will be will be examined by the Television Advisory Committee set up by the Postmaster General, and that committee will recommend to the Postmaster General what we should do in this country. So that is the present position about colour, and it'll be some time before any decision is made.
That means that really nobody's throwing their money away to buy a black and white set at the moment.
No, that's perfectly true.
And just one other question now. What about any startling or spectacular developments? Are we going to find anything really surprising? For example, are we ever going to be able to get television pictures direct from the United States of America?
Well, it's very difficult to say. The transmission of television over long distances, especially over sea, is very difficult indeed, because you have to have intermediate points, relay positions, and of course it's not so easy to have that in the middle of the Atlantic. So that is a problem which we haven't really solved yet, but I've no doubt that sometime in the future that will be done, and in any event the cost, I'm afraid, will be very high, but it's a fascinating possibility which we look forward to with very great interest.
Well, thank you, Sir Harold, very much. Meanwhile, we must just rub along as best we can.
Yes, I think that's the answer.
Thank you.